Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Fida Adeli, and I am the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Clovis and Halas Salam Maqsood Chair in Arab Studies. Before I introduce our event and our speaker, I want to read Georgetown's speech and expression policy as a reminder to us all, and this will also be in the chat. And we have a number of participants online. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that fosters the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respects the right of the speakers and the organizing groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of the discussion, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question, although we may be able to take more than one today. So I should say that CCAS, in partnership with the Sports Industry Management Program at Georgetown University, are pleased to host Dr. Danyel Reiche for a talk entitled "Not Allowed to Win: Exclusionary Policies Towards Palestinian Athletes." Dr. Reiche is a visiting research fellow at the Center for International Regional Studies and a visiting associate professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. At GUQ, he has led research projects related to sports in the Middle East. In collaboration with Paul Brannigan, he co-authored the book Qatar and the 2022 FIFA World Cup: Politics, Controversy, Change. And he teaches a cross-campus class that includes students both from the Hilltop here in DC and Doha, a class entitled Soccer Politics. Before joining GUQ, Danyel was a tenured associate professor for comparative politics at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and he also held the position of a visiting assistant professor for energy and international affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Dr. Reiche will begin with a presentation, and then I will ask some questions, and then we will open it up to those in the room as well as those on Zoom. If you have any technical issues, please email coco.tate@georgetown.edu, and that information is also available for you in the chat. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Danyel Reiche.
Thank you, Frida. Good afternoon in the room and good afternoon to everybody online. Frida mentions that I have been a visiting assistant professor for energy and international affairs here at Georgetown. This was my first job, actually, after I completed all my degrees in Germany. And so all my degree work has been on environment and energy policy. And after being here on the Hilltop, I applied worldwide for jobs and ended up at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And and I noticed, as a lifelong soccer fan and sport enthusiast, I noticed that in Lebanon, all the major sports clubs, be it in soccer, be it in basketball, are affiliated with a certain party or a certain religion. And this was like how my first step into the study of sports started, because I was interested in that. Because there's always this claim in the literature that sport is a force for good and sport unites people. But in Lebanon, it's the opposite. It's more like that it's deepening existing tensions. And so this was my first peer-reviewed article, War minus a shooting ? The politics of sport in Lebanon. And I noticed that all the major, but also smaller groups in Lebanese societies had their clubs. And often they would even play in the color of the supporting party, like the clubs that supported by Hezbollah would play in yellow, for example. And so there's a club for, you know, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims. There are different clubs, and there's also competitions. And within the sects, the Greek Orthodox, the Druze, the Armenians, which are just like 2% or so of the population, but no Palestinian club. But that was not like a major issue of that research, but I just noticed. And so I started to develop a class on the politics of sport. And I remember when I taught it the first time, one of the major readings was from one Georgetown professor, Victor Shah. He wrote a book on the politics of sport in Asia. And so I looked into other topics and continued publishing on Lebanese sports. And for example, an article on Lebanon at the Olympics. And one of the main findings was that Lebanon largely relies on diaspora athletes. So they're often like people who grow up in the US or Brazil. And for different reasons, often because they don't make it here in the national team, and then they discover their roots, then represent Lebanon. But again, I noticed, and there were also like lots of naturalizations, maybe some American basketball players who came over and would later get Lebanese citizenship. And again, I noticed an absence of Palestinians. Later on, rugby league became a big like topic in Lebanon because Lebanon qualified for the Rugby League World Cup, which is not that common that Lebanon would qualify for the World Championship in the team sport. And I wrote a paper on that, and I noticed that this was mainly driven by the Australian diaspora. And so no Palestinians, although, so when I came to Lebanon, there were 4 million people living in Lebanon, around 500,000 of them Palestinians. It's now more because of the influx of Syrian refugees. It went up to 6 million. I think the latest number is 5.5 million. So there are different numbers on Palestinians in Lebanon. The UNRWA, the UN organization who's responsible for Palestinian refugees in the region, says 471,000. The Palestinian Office of Statistics or Census Office, they are saying 510,000. The Lebanese government says 170,000. I'm mainly operating with this UNRWA numbers of 470,000, and half of them lives in 12 refugee camps. The other half lives all over the country. So it took me a while, but then I said, I want to study the Palestinians, a situation of the Palestinians in Lebanon through the lens of sports. And Georgetown, I was at that time still a professor at the American University of Beirut, but Georgetown in Qatar started to do sports projects. So it's the Center for International Regional Studies. The first was titled Sport, Politics and Society in the Middle East. It became an edited volume with Oxford University Press in North America and Hearst in Europe. And I was one of the 2 co-editors. Then there was a second project, Football in the Middle East, in 2019. The first was 2019. The book was published in 2022 and edited by Abdullah Al-Arian, my colleague from history. And what I present here is a chapter I contributed to that book. And we also did a research initiative before the World Cup. It had the title Building a Legacy, Qatar FIFA World Cup 2022. We are not doing an edited volume. We are doing a special issue of the Journal of Arabian Studies, and the title will be different from the one that I just mentioned. But for this World Cup project, just like for information purposes, we did not just work on an academic publication. We also wanted to contribute to constant knowledge production. And there was a blog and a podcast and the lecture series. It's all online available in case you're interested. So I started looking into like Palestinian sport. And the first thing I did was like looking beyond Lebanon. So that's the first part of the article about Palestinian sport in general. And Palestine started to issue passports after the Oslo Accords in 1993. And started also to develop the strategy of gaining statehood through trying to join international sporting associations. And it became, in in the mid-90s, a member of the International Olympic Committee. In 1996, when the Olympics were hosted by the US in Atlanta, Palestine participated for the very first time in the Olympic Games, so the Palestinian Olympic Committee. Just like for information, some of you might wonder, how is it possible that a country that is not a member of the United Nations takes place in a global sporting event? So the UN has 993 member states, but some sporting federations, they have more members. For example, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has 206 members, and FIFA even has 211. So there are some members that are not UN members, like Taiwan or Hong Kong, or American territories like Puerto Rico. So there are a couple of more. And Palestine is like one of these like additional members. So in 1996, Palestine participated for the first time in the Summer Olympics Games. They never participated in the Winter Olympic Games for obvious reasons. And so they always participated in the Summer Olympics with like mini delegations, 2, 3, 4, 5 athletes. Then in 1998, Palestine became also a member of FIFA, the world governing body of soccer, and soccer is the most popular sport in the world. And which again is something being used as a sign of statehood. This FIFA membership, first they become member of the Asian Football Confederations and of FIFA, has worked pretty well, and the men's national football team qualified for the 2015 Asian Football Cup and for the 2019 Asian Football Cup. And in January, I will have the pleasure to see and support them in Doha when they participate in the 2023 AFC Asian Cup. There are 48 countries are members of the Asian Football Cup Confederation. So they qualified when it was 16, now it's 24 teams. So that's quite an accomplishment. And in the FIFA ranking, I checked this at the weekend, they are right now on 96, the men, and the 134, the national women's team. So that's the FIFA story. So they participate in international football and in most international sports like a regular country. And so far, Palestine is recognized by 139 countries, but in sports they managed to have equality with all other countries in almost all sports, in soccer and the International Olympic Committee, but in many sports. Then, okay, that's the international level. When it comes to Palestinians from Lebanon, this is for them a problematic area that the Palestinian Authority started to issue passports after 1993 because they are stateless. They have this refugee card, and the passports are issued to those who have a birth certificate, born in Palestine, and are residents there. So I interviewed couple of players, and so in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, when Palestine was not yet recognized in international sports, there were often refugees from Lebanon who would represent Palestine, but they were not an official like a country that could try to qualify for the Asian Football Championship or for the World Cup or for the Olympics, but they mainly did friendlies. So they did friendly matches against friendly states like Jordan, Qatar. And so, but they were often like Lebanese athletes. But this ended for them a bit with like the issuing of passports. And so then there is the diasporas. Okay, there are around 6 million Palestinians in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza. And there, the Palestinian census office, they are saying 12.5 million is the diaspora. There are different numbers, but there are certainly far more Palestinians abroad than in Palestine. Similar to the Lebanese, there's also huge Lebanese diaspora. And so we sometimes read the success stories of diaspora teams. For example, some of you might have read that there is in Chile, in South America, there is a club called Deportivo Palestino. Chile is the largest Palestinian diaspora outside the Middle East. There are around 500,000 people of Palestinian descent living in Chile. The immigration to Chile goes far back to the early 20th century for economic reasons, but also because the Ottomans like to draft young Christian Palestinians for the army and use them as a cannon fodder. So that was also like a driver for immigration. And and this club was also established early in the 20th century, and the men's team won twice a championship of Chile, the men's soccer team, the women's team once. And they made global headlines in 2014 when they had on their back of the shirts the number 1 in the shape of Palestine before the creation of Israel. And so this made like global headlines, also big story in the New York Times, and I think they were fined by the Football Federation for that. So there is these diaspora teams also serve as a tool for identity, to bring people from that community together in that space, but also to express solidarity with the homeland. And so a second famous club is, since Fida is from Jordan, is Al-Wehdat. They were established as a refugee teams. They played at the beginning in a refugee league, but then they were integrated into the regular Jordanian league, and the men's team won 17 times the Jordanian soccer championship. And it's also very important, maybe one of the few, if not the only arena to express openly Palestinianness. So they're often like chants, and Dag Turstad, a Norwegian scholar, he has published a couple of great articles on that team. And so that's like another diaspora team that is quite well known. But then I was just thinking there's not such a story from Lebanon, like Deportivo Palestino or Al-Wehdat. And we come back to that in a minute. Then, of course, there is my PhD supervisor said never say of course, so I'm not saying of course. There is then Palestinian sport in Palestine and in West Bank and Gaza and in Israel. I mean, 21% of the Israeli population are Palestinian, Arabs, Bedouins, and so they have their own clubs, and they also play in like regular Jewish clubs. So there's both. And Tamir Sorek, who is a professor at Penn State, an Israeli-American, he wrote his PhD on Arab football in Israel, and it had the subtitle, The Integrative Enclave. So, and what he wanted to say with this title is that there are often rightfully the claims of apartheid when it comes to Israel. But in sport, it's quite integrative, and it's different, for example, to South Africa. So I studied in South Africa a year in 1996, 2 years after apartheid had ended. And that was also a time when the entire sports sector was newly organized and everybody needed to get used to play with each other, because that was not the case during apartheid. There were separate leagues for white people, for black people, for colored people. But this is not the case in Israel. And this is, I think, also why now BDS, they have made some statements on sport, but this sporting boycott never became like a major topic of this whole boycott campaign. So, yeah, there are, since the 1970s, there are Arab Israelis playing in the Arab national team, in the Israeli national teams, for example. And so when you see the Israeli national soccer team, both men and women play, they're always like Arab Israelis in the team. There are Arab clubs now in the Israeli men's soccer league. At the moment, there are 14 clubs, and there are 2 Arab clubs, Sagnin, pronunciation might be wrong, and Maccabi Reini. And so the case of Sagnin is interesting because they won in 2004 the Israeli State Cup and then qualified for the Europa League. So there was an Arab Israeli team representing Israel in European competitions. in 2004. And so there is Arab football in Israel. And then, of course, there's the Palestinian football in sport. I'm mainly focusing on football, but / sport. So this is a bit like a tragedy, as many other things, because of the limited, of the limitation of mobility in Palestine, as they cannot have in any sport one championship. So there are two separate championships. So, for example, in football, there is like a football league in the West Bank, and there's a football league in the Gaza Strip. And while I'm talking about this, of course, now since October 7, everything is on hold, both in Israel, West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip. So they have two separate championships. And then there was an idea to have like at least one common thing and cup competition, like working like in a playoff system. And so the idea was that then the winner of Gaza Strip and the winner of West Bank would at the end play against each other to determine like the winner of the Palestinian Cup. And this happened the last time 2018, and when it was scheduled for 2019, it was like a two match. The first match in the Gaza Strip took place, but the second match in the West Bank could not take place because the Gaza Strip players didn't get visa to pass and to go to the match. So that's how this ended. And the football league in the West Bank is pretty good. One can also make good money. So there are also like people of Palestinian descent from all over the world going there. And the Palestinian sport is part of Asian sport. So now, since I talk in that chapter on soccer, the winner of the West Bank League qualifies for an Asian club competition. They have also, like in Europe, the Asian Champions League, and they have a second-tier competition, and then a third-tier competition, the AFC Challenge League, and for that, the champion of the West Bank qualifies. While the teams from Israel, including if, like in 2004, an Arab Israeli team wins, they qualify for European competitions. Israel was part of Asia, which geographically it is. And I wrote a couple of years ago, I think in 2018, I wrote a paper that was published in the Middle East Journal on the sporting boycott of Israel. And I'm telling the story how Israel started as an Asian country after its creation and participated in the Asian Games. But then there were often boycotts occurring, not just from Arab countries, also from countries like Pakistan. And so there were often athletes or teams not willing to participate against Israel. So there were many incidents, but they continued participating starting 1954. And in 1962, Indonesia was not willing to host Israeli athletes in the Asian Games. So they didn't participate in 1962. And the International Olympic Committee punished then Indonesia by expelling them for the next edition of the Olympic Games. So then Israel continued participating in the Asian Games and in all kinds of Asian sporting competitions. But when in 1978, Thailand hosted the Asian Games, Thailand was in a financially difficult situation and needed financial help from Gulf countries. And the Gulf countries said, we give you help, but under the condition you don't give visa to Israel. So this was then the end of Israel's participation in Asian competitions. It took some more years until they were officially expelled. And I mean, what happened is that in 1982, the Asian Games Federation transformed into the Asian Olympic Committee, and Israel was not allowed to join that. And then from the early 80s until the mid-90s, Israel was not part of any sporting continent. So, and that gave like international sporting federations like FIFA always a hard time, because when there was a World Cup, they had to think, how can we like give them the opportunity to participate? So there were then always own rules made, like they would maybe play against like a team from Oceania or South America or whatever that narrowly did not qualify on that continent and would do like a playoff against Israel, etc. So it's like a, you know, there is somebody who wrote a dissertation just on this. So but then after the end of the Cold War, they were admitted into the European world of sport. So the Soviet Union had always like blocked this, that Israel could join European federations. But after the end of the Cold War, it happened. And so this is the story why Israel, including like Arab Israeli clubs, participating in European sports, while Palestinians do in Asian sports. So now talking about Lebanon. In Lebanon, Palestinians face several discriminations, both in general in society and in sports. So politics and sport and politics in sports. First of all, when it comes to politics and sports, Palestinians, they cannot own property, for example. They used to do, but since 2001, that's not allowed anymore. They are not allowed to work in 39 professions. So I found this always sad when I had Palestinian students at the American University of Beirut and knew they like many jobs they could not like work in later on. And when it comes to like general like health, education, they cannot access these services. They rely on UNRWA, the United Nations Organization for Palestinian Refugees. So that's the situation for Palestinians in general. And there have been only like mini waves of naturalization of Palestinians. And there's also a dissertation just on the naturalization of Palestinians in Lebanon by a woman named, surname is Gandour. And in the 50s, there have been a couple of 10,000. And in 1994, Prime Minister Hariri, a building is named after him here, he naturalized 150,000 people, 30,000 of them Palestinian, but mainly Christian Palestinians. Because there is always this topic in Lebanon about a confessional balance. Whatever you discuss, it always comes to the confessional balance, and there has been a lot of like Christian immigration to South America, to the US. So the Christians became smaller by numbers, and there has been an interest then to increase a bit the Christian presence. By the way, the last census in Lebanon happened in the 1930s because there are political interest not to have a new census. And because Shia most likely would like be much more than before. So both the Sunni Muslims and the Christians don't want a new census, which would benefit the Shia. So, then specifically in sports, of course, the question was, is this any different? Is there like a lack of discrimination in sport? And it used to be an integrative enclave, up to the 1970s. There was also when the PLO was in Lebanon from when they were expelled from Jordan in 1970s, they were until 82 in Lebanon, and then you might know, during the war, they were expelled to Tunisia, and they also put a lot of money into sports. That was something they promoted. So it was a bit like a golden time of Palestinian sport in Lebanon. And but Palestinians would just also play in the regular Lebanese clubs. And then in 1984, the Lebanese Football Federation Association, they implemented a cap of 3 foreign players per team. So to promote local football, as I said, and Palestinians were considered to be foreigners. And so after this was implemented, usually then these 3 spots for foreigners were taken by Palestinians. It was still the civil war. Foreigners were not much interested to come to Lebanon. But when the civil war ended in 1919, this has devastating effects for Palestinian athletes, because then the clubs, you know, some supported by billionaires like Hariri, etc., they were like keen to bring a Brazilian, to bring an African. And that was a bit the end for Palestinian players. And then in 1998, starting the season 1998-1999, there was a change to the benefit of the Palestinians, because there was a discussion in Lebanon that this is really discriminatory to the Palestinians. They don't really have opportunities anymore to play a football apart from in their camp teams. So then there was a rule implemented that every team could have one Palestinian on top of the 3 foreigners. So they could even sign more Palestinians, but in the match day squad of 18 players, it could be just like one Palestinian. So there are 157 soccer teams in Lebanon at the time I did the research. So then there would be like 157 spots. And again, they could recruit, some clubs started to recruit them two Palestinians, that there is some competition between them, but just one of them could like make it into the match day squad. So that was starting 1998, 1999. But then, and I'm studying now sports since more than a decade, but I haven't heard this from like any other country in the world. They introduced also a rule starting 1998, 1999, that the goalkeeper had to be Lebanese.
Because they wanted to
because there were many good Palestinian goalkeepers, and they said we need to have stronger Lebanese goalkeepers to be more successful. I really, without exaggeration, I spent hours to click through all the Lebanese matches of the Lebanese men's national team since they introduced these rules. And the 2 most kept goalkeepers since then, the one grew up in Sweden and the other one in Sierra Leone. So I'm not sure whether this had like any impact on getting better Lebanese goalkeepers. So that's the situation since then. And in other sports, it's even worse. For example, in basketball, there is not this like one Palestinian rule. So there are the Palestinians who live in 4th generation in Lebanon. They're considered to be a foreigner. And then in reality, there is many Palestinians play like for camp teams, and also those who don't live in the camp, because 55%, according to the UNRWA numbers, of Palestinians don't live in the camp, but they are eligible to play in a camp team. So it's mainly like a very like, yeah, unprofessional camp leagues, and since there are so limited spots available in the main teams. So in the first Lebanese league, 12 teams, talking about men's football, second league, 12 teams, and then third and fourth league, all other teams. So if some money is made in the first and second league, so in reality, there are like 24 spots that are for like a population of 500,000, of whom maybe half of them are men, available. So that's the situation. And again, in some sports like basketball, it's even worse. And so maybe to before we move to discussion, just like to talk about like possible solutions. So one thing that I still don't understand is there are all the time people naturalized, but not Palestinians. And also in the interviews I did, there was like, I talked to somebody who plays rugby. He played until he was 14, 15 basketball. And he said to me, you know what, they rather naturalize an American than a Lebanese, than a Palestinian. So that's of course like, and most countries in the world, they have in their citizenship laws, they state that you can be naturalized for exceptional services, which often sport is one of the key areas, and many countries do this. Qatar a little bit too much, maybe, where I live now. But so that's like one. Then I wrote a paper recently on It's called national representation without citizenship, the special case of rugby. And so there is rugby, and there are a few other sports where you don't have to be a citizen to represent a country in international sports, where you can qualify by residence. And in rugby, which is a bit awkward, but that are the rules, you can also qualify by the citizenship of your parents or grandparents. So when you can prove your grandparents were Lebanese, for example, then you upload on this electronic tool the citizenship of your grandparents, and you can also play for the country. The reason is not really to help like Palestinians living in refugee camps in Lebanon. This developed, I studied this for the article, so this developed historically because that are Commonwealth sports, and there were often students from Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, who moved to Oxford, Cambridge, University of Edinburgh, and the idea was to give them the opportunity to play for the national team, because at that time when this started, traveling would last weeks or whatever. So but that's an interesting rule, and so I discussed this like in general because this would give like stateless people the opportunity. And there is in the Lebanese national rugby team, there is also like we're 1 or 2 cases of Palestinians playing. So but this whole topic, statelessness, is not a big topic, maybe because we have a global population of 8.1 billion people, and there are approximately 10 million stateless, so not that many. And but that would be a solution. And another interesting recent development was that at the last 2 Olympic Games, there was a refugee team. But this was not like really implemented for the support of stateless athletes. It was more like for refugees of war. And many Syrians were, for example, in the last 2 Olympic refugee teams, like this one famous swimmer, you might have seen the Netflix movie, who lives now in Germany. But because the problem in sport and when it comes to Olympics is that to be nominated by your country, you need to participate in national championships. But of course, when as a Syrian refugee, when you move from Syria to Germany, you won't travel back to Syria to participate in the domestic championship to qualify for the Olympics. So that was more the rationale of this like Olympic refugee team, to give those athletes who don't have the opportunity to qualify national competitions. But of course, this is also something that could include stateless athletes. That's a situation. There's not like a big discussion on this residence rules that exist like in few sports, but I think that's just like interesting, and it also from like as a political scientist interesting, takes the power away from a government to decide who belongs and who does not, because you just belong by being and contributing at a certain place for a certain time. So that's interesting, but maybe I stop at this point and happy to take questions and hear your opinions. And
first, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have lots of questions. I'm gonna just ask 2 and then open it up to everyone else. One is maybe an easier one. So my first question is, you started out by talking about how the Palestinians after 93 used sport to gain recognition as a state. And we know they've tried to do that in other spaces too. So was there significant objection to that? Was there an objection to Palestine participating as a country in international sporting?
No, I think there was not much objection because Israel is on a different continent in sports than because when you see, for example, story of Kosovo, they have like opponents on the same continent.
Yes.
But I think because the way it works is you first become a member of your continental federation and then of the global. And usually the global federations take anybody that is in the continental. With Kosovo, it was awkward because I think they first became member of FIFA and then later on of the continental, but that's a separate story. But no, since they are on different continents and there's overwhelming support for Palestine and Asia, this worked well. Yeah.
So I have another question. it's less about the Lebanon case and some of the other cases you talked about, or you talked about sports as like identity building or representation. And and you mentioned Wahdat, and Wahdat and Faisali have this rivalry in Jordan. Although it was interesting to watch the Faisali club waving Palestinian flags at the last match because of what's going on right now, when they're usually so xenophobic towards each other. But it's interesting to think about the shifts of those kind of alliances. But I was also thinking about kind of sports as political representation and sports as kind of more political participation, right? And I don't know a lot about this field, but like I know a lot has been written about like the ultras in Egypt. And so have you seen that in other cases where it's beyond representation, which itself has political effects, of course, representation, to being more directly involved? You started by talking about Lebanon and these clubs that are affiliated with parties. So what are the lines between the kind of like active participation in politics versus kind of representing particular political parties in your research and some of the contexts you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, each sports system is different, and of course, in America is, for example, is more like companies, so as a professional club, so there is not like really a political image. But in Europe, it's different, and there are often like when we see, for example, Barcelona is a club like that is a symbol of all those who wish independence for Catalonia. Or the Basque in Spain is a similar story. There are often clubs who historically might have more like working class identity, like in the north of England often, Bayern Munich, they used to have a Jewish president before World War II, so they take pride in this part of the history. But there's also like when it comes now we just had in my soccer politics class last week this discussion about like players making statements now in the Gaza war. And here in DC, the Washington Wizards, they have the only Israeli NBA player, and he made like statements that he stands with Israel, and there were like many others, soccer players particularly, made like statements in support of Palestine. And there were like also some awkward discussions when Benzema, the former Ballon d'Or winner who plays now in Saudi, made a statement in support of Palestine, that some right-wing French politicians said that he should lose his French citizenship. So there's, of course, also there is, it used to be, there used to be this phrase of shut up and dribble, or this expectation that like athletes wouldn't express their views, and this has totally changed. And there has been now lots of supports from athletes for Palestine. There have been also cases where athletes lost their employment, like one player in the Bundesliga with Mainz and one player in the French league. And there have been, there have been teams, Ajax Amsterdam and Tottenham Hotspurs. The fans would always wave Israeli flags, so for different reasons there is like some affinity by the fans with Israel. There are many other clubs where fans would support Palestine. For example, was recently, for example, in Scotland, the Celtic Glasgow fans, they would like wave Palestinian flags. And so some sports leagues, they are also now a little bit afraid that the arenas become too political. So the Premier League, but also here in the US, the Major League of Soccer, they have banned flags now from stadiums. But yeah, no, there are sometimes, clubs have developed historically in a certain way that they have a certain identity, and sometimes fans for different reasons might feel like connected to a certain cause and start supporting it.
You remind me of Kirkpatrick kneeling during the national anthem in the US, right? And kind of being black Not Kirkpatrick, it's Kaepernick. Kaepernick, yeah. And that went on for about a year here.
Yeah.
Athletes kneeling during the national anthem.
Yeah, and he's still not employed by a team. So,
he's still not employed.
of course, like there were other examples. 1968, there were like African American athletes like making the Black Power salute and were later on suspended. So there have always been incidents, and the most remarkable has certainly the sporting boycott of South Africa. And when look at the scholarly literature on why did apartheid end, this is always like mentioned as one of the reasons, because they were, South Africa was basically excluded from everything. So, and this is a sports-mad country, and they love rugby, soccer, cricket, and they were expelled from everything. So that was a pretty effective boycott. But something similar is not realistic with Israel. I often get this question, but it's not realistic. Israel is recognized by 164 countries, and I think the major success from like the Arab countries' point of view was to expel them from Asia to Europe. But I don't think that much more can be achieved. But I think that this war, if it goes on, and that's my concern, that it won't stop anytime soon, might also like more affect the world of sports beyond just like some tweets by this or that athlete, because now coming up are the qualification events for the 2024 Olympics in Paris. And I would be not surprised if there are cases of athletes from Arab countries, from Muslim majority countries who refuse to compete with Israelis. So I think that's something that might happen over the next months to come.
It's interesting. I wasn't going to ask this question, but you brought up the boycott stuff, and I was thinking about South Africa. And I was going to ask like how effective you think the sports boycott was in that overall boycott. And I sense from what you're saying that you thought that was an important part of that overall boycott. But it's also interesting that you think it's not possible with Israel. I mean, I kind of feel like people thought, South Africa, it wasn't a question of recognizing them as a state. It was a question of critiquing the apartheid system, right?
Yeah.
And
the idea of sport, since this is about sport, is that sport brings everybody together and everybody has the opportunity to participate.
Regardless of political.
And this was simply not the case in South Africa.
Yeah.
So they had a white national team, which is 10% of the population, and excluded like 90%. So they had really separate federations, separate sport leagues for the different ethnic groups. And that's not in Israel. There are other reasons to criticize Israel. And one of them, which never became like a global topic, is that in the Israeli football federations, there are 7 clubs members that are located in settlements. And so there were activists like calling for expelling Israel from like International Football Federation because of that, but never became like really like big a global topic. And then of course there is a topic of restricting mobility of Palestinian athletes. And so at the end, I mean, when we talk about two-state solution, etc., I mean, what kind of state should there be that has to run 2 different championships where you cannot,
Questions, anyone? I have more, but
I remember in the late 2000s, there was a goalkeeper who came to play for Ahli Egypt.
Yeah.
I don't remember his name, but that made me wonder how easy for Palestinians players to go play professionally outside of Palestine. Is it like often? Is it easy? Are there restrictions for going?
It's all a question of citizenship. So I interviewed this like Lebanese football player, I'm sorry, this Palestinian football player in Lebanon, and I told him, so I want to build this paper I'm writing around the argument that you are facing a dual periphery. You cannot play for Lebanon and you cannot play for Palestine. And he said, no, it's a triple periphery. So that made it to the title of the article. That's from him. He said it's triple periphery because I don't have a passport. Also, my mobility is limited that I can try to play as a professional player in other countries. You know, it's not like with this refugee travel cards that you can easily travel somewhere for because when you're recruited, maybe they might invite you for a test practice or something like this. It's so difficult. So mobility is so much limited for somebody with this refugee card. And but when you have Palestinian citizenship, of course, in the West Bank, you have Palestinians in the West Bank Football League, you have players from all over the world. And it's by the way interesting that also in the Palestinian national teams, there were always historically players who grew up in Israel, Arab Israeli, and then there was more and more criticism on that in Palestine, and then they introduced I think 5-6 years ago a rule that you can play in the a Palestinian national team even if you were born and raised in Israel, but you cannot play there anymore. You have to play for a club in the West Bank. So usually they play on West Bank clubs. So you cannot play in an Israeli team. And then there are some few cases of players who, for economic opportunities, decided to play in Israel, and so that means they can't play anymore for the Palestinian national team. Yeah.
I knew a young woman who played basketball, Palestinian Israeli citizen, and she was quite good. And so she had to make this decision at some point whether to change high school. So she'd been going to a private, Christian school for Palestinians. But if she wanted to really be able to compete on Israeli basketball teams, she had to go to this.
Yeah.
And it was I don't even remember, I know her uncle well. I don't know what she decided in the end, but it was a decision also. Her family had been emphasizing her Arabic identity, Arabic language, and this was a decision to kind of totally immerse herself in a new space if she decided she wanted to play for these competitive Israeli teams. Just an anecdote.
But it's a good anecdote because, of course, we are here in an education institution, etc. We see the big picture, but from an aesthetics point of view, it's often just about where can I better develop, where can I better grow. Those topics often come then later into life, but there's also often much family pressure, all over the world. I mean, I can also see, I was born and raised in Germany, that many Germans of Turkish origins, that there came then some family pressure to play for Turkish teams. So family, of course, always plays a role.
Questions, anyone? Do you have any questions online?
Because we talk about angles. I was listening for when everybody went, ooh, on a fact, and then I wrote those down.
Do you have any questions online? I have a couple more if we don't. But...
Yeah, we can stick with yours.
Okay. Well, we talked about boycotting athletes, and I was also thinking about kind of the reaction to the Russian invasion or occupation of part of Ukraine, right? And all of a sudden, everything Russian under the sun was up for boycott, and there was this discussion of boycotting Russian athletes. And I don't even know where it ended up, right? That they were able to compete, but not under the name of Russia. Is that right?
So they were expelled from many international sporting federations, for example, from FIFA. They could not continue participating anymore in the qualification for the World Cup in Qatar. Although this was a lengthy process, they were in a qualification tournament, and all other teams said then, including Poland, which hosts many Ukrainian refugees, said they wouldn't play against Russia. So they were at the end suspended. But of course, I have this also in my classes in Qatar. Students often say there are double standards. There is this harsh reaction on Russia. and there's not like a similar response to Israeli human rights violations, and that's true. But of course, again, sports, this is first organized on the continental level, and but for me, as a scholar who works now for years on these topics, I really have to say, I'm also struggling to give a good answer on the question where to draw the line, because I mean, this war in the Ukraine, that's just horrible. I mean, now approximately 500,000 people died there. So, I mean, this is like after World War II in Europe. That's really, and it's affecting the lives of many people, and you know, their loved ones who lose a family member. There are millions of refugees, and there are now more Ukrainian refugees in Germany than there were Syrian refugees, and everybody was already thinking that something like this will never ever happen again, that so many people would like come from one conflict. So it's severe. But still, the IOC president Thomas Bach, he tries to bring in Russian athletes for the Olympics next year as like independent athletes, so without like national flag, and but there's lots of resistance by international sporting federations who at the very end have to implement that. And for example, one of the largest sporting federations, World Athletics, they already said they won't give like Russian athletes the opportunity. But in some other sports, like for example tennis, you have Russian athletes continue to participate. Last year, Wimbledon didn't allow them, which was controversial. But also in tennis, I think the athletes are more considered less. They're more like, you know, cosmopolitan. They live all over. But so again, this Russian war in Ukraine is horrible. But like from a scholarly point of view, when it comes to like expelling countries from international sports, which is one of the last arenas that brings everybody together, I ask myself also where to draw the line, because they are like, I mean, the war in Yemen, horrible. And so it's not the only conflict in the world. So it's difficult. It's difficult where to draw the line. But I understand also say there are double standards and there are harsher reactions on Russia than on Israel.
Yeah, or even the US for that matter, right?
Yeah.
Invading Iraq.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this mirrors international law and international institutions, right? When do these things work and for whom and why? And that's unfortunate. Maybe sometimes we all align around an issue, but the US was one of the last to come around to the South Africa boycott, for example. The US and Israel, actually, not the citizens. Citizens were protesting for it, but the regimes. Anyway, that's not your topic, but I want to.
No, but I can't really answer where to draw the line. I think it's easiest when you have like sport-specific issues. Yeah. Like with apartheid, South Africa, it was very obvious that you know you had the separation within sports.
I see.
Yeah. So when it comes to Israel, I would always argue, rather than with like general human rights violations, I would always argue, why are they allowed to have like clubs from settlements in the federation, for example? That I think is a better argument when it comes to sport, although it's a very minor issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I read about there being some campaigns on like the boycott of Israel in sports because of like a lot of them targeting Palestinian athletes and like imprisoning Palestinian athletes. So I was wondering if you think that there's more room if we kind of frame it around like yeah, basically like I don't know, I was reading stuff about them like shooting the kneecaps of Palestinian soccer players and stuff like that.
Yeah, I read these articles as well, that now maybe some athletes were specifically targeted in the war, etc. I don't know whether this will lead to anything. I expect, it's always difficult to make predictions, but I expect in the next months when all these qualification events happen for Paris 2024, I expect more like on the individual level that we will see athletes who might refuse to compete with Israeli, or minor incidents like maybe not shaking hands or things like this. But since I live now in Qatar, countries like Qatar, but also UAE, they have big major state goals are associated with sports. So they host like all these events to gain soft power, to punch above their weight in international affairs. And they couldn't do all of this if they would not let Israelis participate, because the general idea of like when you want to host an international sporting event, it's always the idea that you accept everybody to participate regardless of nationality, religion, ethnicity, and so on. And this is why Lebanon has and will never host international championships, because of the boycott of Israel. They would not issue visas to Israeli. And that's why they are limited to a regional, continental events. But the Gulf countries have like bigger goals. And so but still there were like, just this year was a judo world championship in Qatar. And there are then incidents that it's forgotten to hoist the Israeli flag or something like this. So these incidents happen all the time. But they would not issue visas to Israeli, it won't happen, because it would risk the general objectives of these countries. And Qatar, this goes back to my talk I gave on Thursday in the government department on the politics of the World Cup. But Qatar is a small state, and there come also issues like national security into play. They're surrounded by big neighbors, so they do all of this to connect with the rest of the world, also like as a life insurance for their own security. So it won't happen, but I think it will happen on an individual level, that we see athletes who will refuse to compete with Israelis, and it might also happen then at the Olympics itself, because this war unfortunately might go on. Yeah, so the topic won't go away. It won't.
We have a question also, can I take the question online for those things? So there's a question online about youth sports in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, if you can speak to that, any of them. And whether you think youth sports can help build relationships either among players or parents in these various contexts. I don't know if that's,
I think, there are, of course, in Israel, there are initiatives. There are also like, for example, a couple of, that's not my field, I think 8 or 9 public schools which have the main focus of having Jewish, Arab, Druze people in these schools. That's a small percentage compared with the overall number of schools. But there are these projects to bring like communities together also in sport. In Lebanon, at the end, you need to pay for everything.
Yeah.
And this things so I know I went to a chess club and there were Palestinians, for example, but they had to pay like everybody else. So and it's often like also like social economic limitation of participation. But there are lots of activities by UNRWA. School sport in these UNRWA schools is often a disaster. And there's also research on like studies about dropout from UNRWA schools, and that's always like one of the factors. And no good like no good sport activities, no good after school activities, extracurricular activities. But UNRWA introduced a couple of years ago. They call it the Palestinian, like the Olympics for the Palestinians of Lebanon. That's something that's happening. But so no,
it's just Palestinians. It's not.
But no, but no youth club would say we don't take a Palestinian.
Oh, okay.
It's no, but unless he or she
Yeah.
pays. So limitations come then later when when it's like what we discussed at the beginning, when they would like want to play in like a men's, women's, a soccer team, then that we have these caps.
Okay.
But on the youth sport level, the main limitation is socio-economic. You need to drive to the facilities. You need to pay for participation.
I mean, I would add from a little bit I know about just the educational system in Israel, right? That education is completely segregated, right? You have
Apart from like these 8-9 schools, yeah.
the 8 or 9 schools, and then some, I think some private schools, right? And this is the anecdote I gave earlier about the young woman who wanted to play basketball. I think it was a question of whether she would go, or maybe it was a public school. But anyway, there was a pathway into an Israeli Jewish school for her as a basketball player at the high school level. I'm guessing it was a private school, right? Because the public system is completely segregated, except for these handful of schools, which are primarily like elementary schools.
Maybe they give a couple of scholarship as a sign of inclusivity to Arabs. At the end, in South Africa, you know, now I don't know who of you followed the Rugby Union World Cup, but there were many black players in the South African team, and often they got scholarship from like Afrikaans schools. So it's not like that it has become really more inclusive and diverse. It's just like that these schools want to showcase diversity by giving like few scholarships to people from other communities. Still better than if they would not do it, but
Yeah.
you know.
And on the financial side, I think it's true even here in the US, that to become a competitive athlete now requires quite a bit of investment from your parents early on for clubs and that, I mean.
Yeah, particularly in soccer. So
Yeah.
pay to play schemes. Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned like the banning of flags, and I think you mentioned it in the context of the US, and I was wondering about this because like at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, like I feel like I was living in Portland and there were several games where they would like openly raise all the ticket proceeds went to like,
Yeah.
and like the players would like play matches in like the colors and like all of those things. So I was wondering, like, obviously this is not necessarily like the first controversial conflict that's happened since people have played sport. So like do you see like a lot of like flip-flopping on those kinds of rules on like we don't want to see flags for this, so we're gonna ban flags, like that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when the war in Ukraine started, it was I follow German soccer, it was common to have like the peace symbol like in the middle of the pitch, or showing Ukrainian flags in the stands. And Shireen Ahmed wrote a good commentary yesterday. I read it, where she was like arguing against this ban of flags. And I also think what is so threatening about people waving a Palestinian flag, or I mean, of course, if you accept this, you also need to accept that somebody might go with an Israeli flag into the stands. But what's the issue? I mean, of course, now we have our colleague from the sports management program is not here anymore, and his specialization is on venues. He might rightfully argue they should not take the view of people or something like this, you know. Fine. Yeah, so that's indeed like interesting that like all these bans come in the moment where many people might come with a Palestinian flag to a stadium. Yeah.
Any other questions? We have time. I think I've asked most of them. Let me ask just one final one, and then we can wrap up on that one. And this is about Qatar, which you didn't talk about as much, but you've written extensively about. And your colleague Abdullah Arian, I remember him writing an op-ed around that time.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly if I'm wrong, he was talking about the importance of soccer in the Arab world, but he was also kind of critiquing this over critiquing of Qatar, right? And it was interesting to watch just like how much objection there was to Qatar being the host to this event because of labor issues and because of LGBTQ rights. And yeah, I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, right? Like Qatar and so it's not a real question, but I can't remember what Abdullah, but he was.
No, he wrote in the New York Times an article why the Middle East deserves a World Cup.
Yeah.
I had a couple of days before the World Cup an op-ed in the Washington Post, and which was mainly discussing why the event is controversial, and also the changes that occurred because of the event. And first of all, Qatar is changing because it wants to change. It didn't need the World Cup or FIFA to make some changes. Georgetown started in 2000, so Qatar was awarded the World Cup in December 2010, but Education City exists since 1999, Georgetown since 2005, and many things that we associate with Qatar today, be it Qatar Foundation, Al Jazeera, Qatar Airways, all of this started in the 1990s. And then certainly when Qatar bid for the World Cup in 2009 and was awarded the World Cup in 2010, there's often this claim of sports washing, which makes no sense because of all these critical issues like the situation of migrant workers in the countries nobody knew before 2010. So I think it's the opposite, that Qatar put itself the spotlight on all these issues and then they were being discussed. And of course, the event, I think part of there is, and the Emir himself said several times, it's like Islamophobia, that the World Cup is so much criticized. And I think there is an element of that because there were other non-democratic, also daring countries hosting mega sporting events like FIFA World Cup, like Olympics, and there was not this extent, this severe criticism of it, like in the case of Qatar. So I think it has an element of that. For sure. But of course, there was also criticism justified, and the situation of the migrant workers, which human rights groups criticized. This criticism was justified. What maybe not always was rightfully explained is that kafala is not a Qatar thing. It's like a Gulf thing. And that's not something that Qatar invented, that goes back to British colonialism. But much of the criticism, I think, was right and also at the very end contributed to change in that area. So if there's something where I would say that the World Cup led to change, because most of the changes started much earlier, but on that, yes. And Qatar introduced in 2021 as the first country in the region a minimum wage. It dismantled the kafala system, which means you don't need any more approval by your employer to leave the country or to switch jobs. So there were tangible changes. But what I and Paul Brenning, my co-author, said in this editorial in the Washington Post, we wrote in the last sentence we wrote, it remains to see after the World Cup how sustainable these changes are.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's now 1 year on. This minimum wage has been introduced in March 2021, and it has not been increased since then. Mm. And I also hear, it's not like openly discuss these issues, but I hear now many stories that it's getting more and more difficult to switch jobs. So I know it's always nicer to end with something positive, but it really remains to be seen. Certainly, no, I end with something positive. Certainly, Qatar remains a good global citizen. I think we can really say this. Qatar's role in international affairs is very good. This year we had some earthquakes, for example, in Morocco, in Syria, and Tunisia. Qatar were the first to help. And they're trying to be helpful in diplomacy, in mediation. There was this Iranian-American prisoner swap this year. There was some Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russia were brought back home, and now they also helped that like dual citizens could leave Gaza. I think there are like 2,000 or so people who were able now to exit Gaza, and they helped also that some of those who were taken to hostage on October 7 could like a return home. So like in international affairs, they are really a good global citizen, and they're remaining to do so. When it comes to domestic politics on this issue, particularly migrant worker rights, it remains to see how much committed they are. Although some changes, I think they will never be returned. For example, the international trade unions, they are always saying that the security standards on construction sites in Qatar, they are at least as good, if not even better than in the US and in many European countries. Yeah. And I know from Lebanon, you walk through Lebanon, you see construction sites, nobody has a helmet, no, like not saved, no on a line or things like this. You don't see this in Qatar. You know, it's always like very high safety standards. And then there is a heat protection law since last year. So in the summer months, outside work is not permitted from 10:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon. And so I don't think these changes will be reversed. But on other things like the minimum wage, you know, Qatar reported a budget surplus of $24 billion last year. It won't be different this year. So I think it should be possible also to increase the wages of the workers, and I hope it's going to happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.